towards permanent cropping?
I think part of the answer lies in thinking a bit about supply chains. You know, I think we've been in a period in the past where the supply chains have been a lot of smaller producers supplying a very small number of very large processors and retailers, and a model of really standardization and homogenization. And that was the same not just in agriculture, but in other industries in the post-war period. There was a lot of this idea that modernization meant everything had to look the same and had to be produced in very large volumes at a very consistent quality. If you look at what's happened now in other industries like automotive, that has changed. You know, we now have, you go into a car sales room and you specify your personalized product, and the logistics is now there to deliver that range of diverse products for the consumer. And I think we need a similar kind of approach in thinking about how food production goes going forwards. People want diversity and choice. They want to be able to choose different things that suit their lifestyles and their values. And diversity should be more possible with advanced IT and logistics. So we should be able to produce in a more dispersed and a more diverse way than has been sort of sold to people in the past as the best way to succeed in business is to standardize, specialize, enlarge. You see lots of good examples at a local level of businesses which have diversified, which have a close connection to their customers, to their final consumers, and where you're working in that relationship, that diversity can be supported. So you see a farm that's maybe started as a beef and sheep farm, and 20 years down the line, because of its farm shop, it then has an orchard, it does some soft fruit, it does some fattening of geese and turkeys for Christmas market, and so forth. So it depends a lot on your supply chain, I think, the scope for your ability to reintroduce diversity into a business.
Super. And then just maybe the last one for now, Janet, but just a question from Mario in the chat about what are the issues or drawbacks of over rewilding, our landscapes and reducing management? What are the downsides of that?
Okay, I wouldn't want to say that what's going on in some of our upland areas at the moment is already rewilding, but I would say that I think we can learn a lot from looking at what's not been done very well in respect of agri-environment schemes in the uplands. We've focused on trying to protect the highest value habitats in those landscapes, which have tended to be the real top land, the moorland. It's almost like saying that the agricultural pressure on those areas has been reduced to a point where unfortunately what it then does is make management of that land uneconomic for an upland business, because the constraints are so tight on the land that what used to be a business which used the valley bottom, the side of the hill and the top in an integrated way, moving stock back and forth and using different parts of the landscape in an integrated farming system, has broken down. And what then happens is there's no incentive, there's no economic incentive to manage the land that's really valuable from a nature conservation point of view. And actually the nature conservation value goes backwards when you don't have any management at all. I've been working with a really interesting partnership in Exmoor called Graze the Moor, where they're trying to reintroduce cattle grazing over the winter on moorland, because they know locally that there is a need for that in order to maintain the diversity of that habitat. But the agri-environment schemes were taking all stock off in the winter, causing problems in respect of where do you then put the stock? Do they have to be sent a long way away? Do you have to build sheds to put them in? And not really understanding this importance of interconnection in the landscape. And I think I wouldn't want to criticize people like the Knapp Estate, because I think they're learning a tremendous amount with the experiments that they're doing. But that's a kind of a special case, and it's something that's really valuable for the rest of us to sort of look at and use as a way of learning about what different types of land management will do to biodiversity. But for the country as a whole, we have this tradition of land management, and we have most of our most valuable international biodiversity is semi-natural habitat, which is habitat which has been managed by people for centuries. So if you take away that management, you may well lose what you're valuing.
Super. Thank you, Janet. And there's so much in this from people in the land, specialization, learning. It feels like something that came up in the last session was really, there's so much we don't know, but also there's so much available knowledge out there. How do we make it more accessible? And we'll certainly be picking a lot more of this up in future sessions. But Janet, I'll let you off the hook now for a moment, and we will come to our next panelist, Niels Corfield. Niels is a independent farming consultant, advisor, trainer, educator. I think he's been in this space for a long time, and a lot of practical know-how about how do we do some of this stuff on the ground in our landscape. So Niels, I'll hand over to you.
Great, yeah, thanks, Will. So a couple of things before we begin. A plea, if you like, for those that can, if you could put your cameras on for the duration, that would be nice to be able to see your faces, and then, I mean, obviously, if you haven't got an internet speed, then yeah, that's fair enough. I know, Jane, that you're probably never going to have a camera on for a while yet, but still good to see you've got your avatar there. But otherwise, next thing I'll ask is, how are we all doing? How are we doing today? What's the weather like? Wet and windy? So I've just dropped a link into the chat box to what I call the whole farm planning principles, which is sort of one of the frameworks that I work with to help to inform sort of infrastructure and sort of landscape choices and management practices on the land. And that is part of the sort of wider kind of set, if you like, of soil health and best practice in pasture management. So today we're going to focus on, the kind of like the physical material aspects, with a particular emphasis on trees, because that's the brief. But in this instance, so I'll focus on number 2 on the whole farm planning principles. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but anyway, this is the idea of basically looking to manage our existing hedges for maximum benefit or function, basically. So the take-home message is here, guys, time to park the flail, and we can do a few new things, basically. So the thing that I would say is, initially, we want to be moving away from just managing, which is effectively just what's kind of like flailing is, and looking to sort of maximize sort of like biodiversity, for example, so letting them thicken up and letting them grow out, for example, and then potentially putting them through into like a coppice regime, for example. So in a similar way to sort of laying, so we can kind of maintain the sort of like hedge, the multi-stemmed nature, and we no longer require, it's no longer a primary requirement for hedges to provide stock proofing. We have quite decent temporary fencing, electric fencing options that can be used both to establish new hedges and new trees plantings, but also to stock proof any shapes of land, basically. So putting your hedges through to something like a 10 or 15 year cycle, for example, has been shown to yield sort of commercial grade biomass that you can use on farm, either for bedding or for heating or for mulch or composting, etc. And one of the reasons why hedges score so highly in terms of the biomass value is that they're going to contain thorns often. So if anyone's ever had possibly the misfortune of putting on a hawthorn log, you know about it. You better be ready for the long haul, basically, or be ready to strip off, because they are seriously energy dense. But it's a great log for keeping the burner in overnight, for example. So other than that, there are some really quite convenient methods now for coppicing hedges. So you can use sort of circular saw blades on the back of the tractors, for example, so just driving along and cutting that material. And then once you've cut it once, basically, it should then be in cycle. You can leave standards, for example. So there's some quite good examples of worked firewood businesses that are based around hedge coppice. And yeah, it's a good sort of like overwinter income. It's low investment in terms of capital. And again, brings a little bit of income in. So probably what you might call the off season, basically. Okay, so kind of one of the ways that the whole farm planning principles are arranged or ordered is that it's sort of the easiest things first, if you like, the things that are your most common on a farm, for example. That's why we talk about fields first and then hedges next, if you like. But we'll skip on to those that are now relevant for introducing new tree plantings, if you like. The first one we'll look at here is to increase structural diversity on the farm, basically. Typically our farms are fairly not necessarily uniform, but in terms of, so you have sort of trees over here, either in woodland blocks and cropping or grass over here, for example, or you might have trees around the edges, for example. So typically you might have peripheral tree plantings. What we should be looking to do is introduce trees into the interior of our managed blocks, basically. You might call them fields or whatever, basically. So integral rather than peripheral. So we can gain more of those soil health benefits, basically, by bringing in more fungally dominated or more fungally supporting species. So trees support or associate heavily with particular types of mycorrhizal fungi. So where you have trees and grasses together, for example, they get to enjoy the benefits of both those types of mycorrhizal fungi. And generally, we should be able to increase the fungal content of our soils. And on the whole, most managed soils, whether they be cropping or grass, are pretty bacterially dominated. And that's why we have tight soils, poor infiltration, boggy fields, all these issues, basically. They all kind of stem from the fact that we have inadequate infiltration, basically. And trees can actually give you like a leg up on that front. So if we look at the Pont Bren example, that's quite a well sort of like studied example from the uplands in Wales, where they had planted their new trees. They were seeing infiltration rates increasing by an order of magnitude. So 10 times increased infiltration rates. In that case, though, I imagine that the control in this case was sort of set stocked sheep pasture. So we should be seeing much better and can be seeing much better performance from our pastures as well. So it's about finding best practice in both realms and bringing them together and integrating them, basically. So integrating rather than segregating. And in terms of biodiversity, where we have two landscape types meeting each other, where trees meet grass, for example, you increase the number of species that you can support, basically. So those birds, for example, they're like open ground, they can utilize the open ground, but they can withdraw to the trees, for example. They can also glean forage from the trees themselves. You can also support those that are only sort of feed off the ground, for example. So it's about creating this sort of like mosaic, if you like, and certainly in an upland context or an estate context or even a parkland context, we can be looking at sort of patchy mosaic type layouts as being the sort of perhaps the go-to option, as opposed to what might be more associated with sort of number 10 here, integrate trees for productive outputs. This is where we'd probably be looking at more sort of kind of regular agroforestry, so tree rows that subdivide fields into kind of useful alleys or sort of like blocks, if you like, perhaps 24 meters wide, 36 meters wide, you know, something that is agriculturally sort of like useful, basically. So you can fit your sprayer up and down one pass, you haven't got to do a half pass, for example. So trying to get the sort of like the drill, the combine and the sprayer, for example, to all be on a like a similar sort of width or increments thereof, for example. But this is where we can be taking the benefits of shelter and shade, and certainly livestock and grasses benefit, but have measurable production benefits from having shade and shelter. So in hot weather, for example, livestock will finish earlier because they're spending less time loafing in the shade, more time grazing. Yeah. And in extreme weather, for example, they spend less time sheltering and more time out grazing, basically. And then you're distributing the manure more regularly across the pasture, for example, as opposed to just manuring the hedge. Because let's face it, the hedge doesn't really need manuring, does it? Yeah, we want to be manuring our pastures and getting the growth responses that brings, basically. So yeah, the final one we'll look at for a wrap up is that yeah, we can be, well, I guess there's two other ones. We can look to protect riparian areas from stock and cropping. So it's really important to have riparian buffer strips in, and where we have controlled access or excluded access for stock, we have much better stream bank integrity, which will give space for re-meandering and also then become basically sort of a wildlife corridor, if you like. And yeah, I think that's probably is about as much as I should say now, basically. But I guess the sort of like the take-home messages here is we're looking to pair up existing sort of like overarching management framework. So if you're all grazing, for example, as opposed to all cropping, are you upland, are you lowland, and then finding a suite of solutions that sort of matches or kind of slots in to that. And yeah, we probably want to get away from this idea of segregated management parcels, if you like, and increase the total output from any area of land, basically. So yeah, I think I shall leave that there.
Super, thank you, Niels. And there's a just touching the surface on a few sort of very practical elements of how we might sort of reimagine elements of our land management. I think hedges are a big area, but I was just wondering if you could give us a sense of like some of the businesses you've worked with or places you've seen and visited. What are the sort of the results they're seeing from increasing diversity and trees and hedgerows and more management of hedgerows and that sort of thing into their farms and businesses? What are they seeing as a result?
Yeah, I think there's a whole range of different cases. So probably one of the sort of really high profile ones is a commercial laying operation in the northwest. I forget exactly where they are or what they're called, basically. But I think they produce the woodland egg brand, the one that was sort of like certified by the RSPCA and is put out, I think, exclusively for Sainsbury's. And I wouldn't be surprised if they are the exclusive supplier. So it's, we're talking like, many boxes of eggs, many thousands of boxes of eggs a day, basically. So it's a large operation, pretty hard nosed, basically. And I can't actually remember what their sort of point of entry was, but basically they sort of like gleaned at some point that chickens do better in trees, or hey, chickens are like a woodland fowl, so like the natural place for them to be is underneath trees. So they planted trees in a couple of areas, and I think mainly through the reduction in mortality, those trees paid for themselves in 2 years. Yeah, and since then they've gone to plant up the entire area. And in their situation, they don't derive any sort of multiple functions. They don't derive any direct outputs, harvests from the trees. It's just there to improve the integrity and the profitability, basically, of their operation. So that's one nice example. Then in the uplands of Scotland, I think his name's Andrew Barber. So he's done some nice plantings on his sort of like high pastures, and where they have trees, basically, the ground stays snow-free and frost-free for longer. Yep, and actually sometimes throughout the winter. And that's with both deciduous and evergreen trees. So we are seeing sort of like measurable changes on microclimate, for example. And that's really what we mean when we talk about this edge effect, is where you have the trees sort of where you're close to the trees, you get the microclimate both above ground and below ground. You get the increase in microbial activity below ground. And yeah, so the more of these little areas we have, basically, the more we can kind of sort of build the whole, if you like.
Super, thank you, Niels. A question which come up from a few different angles in the chat. One early on, just talking about the potential of owls as a natural predator and using hedgerows to increase that. And Alice has just commented on that as well. The beneficial impact of hedgerows on natural predators, which is it's kind of a big part of the agroecological system. It was a big part of the IDRI modelling, looking to increase the amount of area in the UK for these type of ecosystem services and hedgerows performing in this way. What do we see? Like, are there good results from this in terms of like providing in-field predation and controlling pests, weeds, disease, that sort of thing?
I personally don't know of any specific examples, but that's just basically because I've not sort of like either crossed my desk or I've not looked for them basically. But we see a net increase in bird populations, and we see a net increase in invertebrate populations, and I think often to the chagrin of like new tree planters, increases in vole populations, and basically where voles go and where trees are present, they'll be perching. So will predators follow. Unless you have a very, very fragmented landscape. So you're probably going to be seeing kestrels moving in quite readily, and kites. I'd probably say they're the two that come in most immediately, and potentially buzzards. But I think owls are really interesting actually, and like the eagle owl, for example, as a species that could be reintroduced. I think that's something that is really sort of like interesting.
Super. And then we just got another question about user language of a more mosaic landscape, more mixed, diverse sort of land use. And I was just wondering, first part of the question, based on some of the places you've been and farms and land areas in the country, if you are like imagining that in a perfect system in 2030, like what's the sort of some stuff in your head that would work really well in choose a particular landscape? But a secondary question to this, which comes up a lot, is really if we're making more complex landscapes and more diverse landscapes, how do we measure this? How do we monitor it and know that we're making good progress and have good evidence that we can use to back up some of the claims around agroecology, regenerative agriculture? And actually there's an active chat with Becky and many others jumping into this. It seems to be a big area of interest, certainly as we start developing policy in the UK. So I don't know if you could address a couple of those, that would be great, Niels.
Briefly. I think probably the main thing about sort of models, if you like, what's a sort of perfect like patterning. Again, I think that would be sort of there would be sort of maybe 2 or 3 cases for each particular location, or 2 or 3 scenarios for each case, I would say. And then even within the farmlands, the farm holding as one, that can then be a sort of like a blend, and it should really be like a range. And one of the ways that can, people do structure that is that you have like the intensive stuff, the high value stuff, close to any kind of like buildings and center of operations, for example, and the more extensive and then the more wilded areas, for example, would be at the sort of peripheries, if you like. But I think that there's a suite of options for like full straight cropping out in the east, and there is a suite of options for proper sort of like upland sort of croft type setups, for example. But in terms of metrics, I would actually kind of probably just come back to the sort of the standard ones and say that like the ones that we use already, actually things like dry matter, for example, in terms of grass production, or like cost of production, for example, like a proper net yield, net production per unit area. I think I would say that like basically agroecology is, if it's done right, and I guess that's probably the key caveat, is that it will be more profitable than the existing operations. The total output, at least in the short term, may go down, but I mean, I think we need to be profitable. We need to wipe our face before we can start talking about feeding the world, I think. Do you know what I mean?
Super. Thank you, Niels. We'll there's lots of questions coming in now, thinking fast, but we'll let you off the hook for the moment and come back to some of these later in the sort of the more open panel session. Thank you. I can see there's lots of great comments and observations going on in the chat. Please do keep that coming. Also, just a reminder of the the response survey that we put in, just basically giving us a sense of how you view some of the strengths of agroecology, how you view some of the weaknesses, but also we'd really like you to all have a go at, similar to the question I just asked Niels, imagining within your landscape where you live, what that would look like and feel like in 2030 if we had a more agroecological food system up and running. Equally, what would it look like if we just carried on as business as usual today? So we got some really great responses to this from the last session. So it would be great to get your input again. Before I go to the next speaker, just want to line up Archie, who I can see on the screen. We'll come to you after Susan as a bit of an example of someone who's trying to reimagine their landscape where they live and farm at the moment. But Susan, over to you. Delighted to have you here. And if you could, get going with your element of the discussion, that would be terrific.
Thank you, Will, and thanks very much for the opportunity to make some comments on our changing land use. I think for those who don't know, the CLA is a membership organisation for owners of land, business and property across England and Wales. So I'm mainly going to be focusing geographically on those areas, but I have a few comments on Scotland as well, for those of the Scots in the audience. So as we know, as Janet mentioned, there are a lot of demands on UK agricultural land. It is a diminishing resource, given pressures for new houses, forestry, transport. Food production has always been considered its primary function, whether that's directly for grains, fruit and vegetables, or indirectly as feed for livestock. But it is increasingly being recognised as a resource for nature, carbon storage, and contributing to the health and well-being of society. So that opens the door for a different model going forward. There are many different factors driving changes in farming businesses. I think central to these shifts is the agriculture policy outside of the EU Common Agriculture Policy, which has given the four nations of the UK freedom to develop more appropriate policies for the next decades and onwards. The question really now is how quickly these will have an influence on land use and land management decisions. In Scotland, there's going to be no change in current policies until at least 2024, and in Wales, at least 2023. Changes in England are starting earlier, with the removal of direct payments over the next 7 years, starting this year. The flagship public goods scheme, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, will be introduced in part from 2022, but only fully in 4 years' time. So it feels too early to say exactly how this is going to change farming and land use. It's clear that the removal of direct payments will have a significant impact on farming profitability. Currently, only 25% of farming enterprises are profitable without direct payments. And this is going to have the biggest impact on businesses, particularly those that are mainly involved in farming, and those that with grazing livestock and commodity cereal sectors, who we know are more reliant on the basic payment income. The question really is, knowing what the changes are going to be, how will that impact on changes in the landscape? The Environmental Land Management Scheme will not be fully available until 2024, and by then most current BPS recipients, Basic Payment Scheme recipients, will have had at least a 50% cut in their direct payments. And also, Environmental Land Management Scheme is not designed as a replacement for BPS, so the money will be distributed in a different way. So in the short term, reductions in BPS funding will be redirected into grant schemes to support productivity growth, a farming resilience programme to provide advice to help people think about what their options are for the future, and national pilots for the Environmental Land Management Scheme and animal health and welfare programmes, along with the early introduction of the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which seems to move things in the direction of encouraging more people to move more in the direction of agroecological practices. But it's worth noting agricultural policy is not the only driver of change. Farmers and landowners are increasingly considered to be part of the climate change solution through changes in land use and soil management to build and protect carbon stores. And that might mean contributing to farming businesses away from food production, with opportunities around renewable energy production, biomass and forestry, which is taking land away from food production. There's also market drivers, such as changes in consumer choices, supply chain requirements and international trade agreements, which will influence what we grow and how land is farmed in the future, And again, we're at an early stage in these developments to really know what direction that's going to go in. I think I would highlight the role of supply chains here. There is plenty of evidence to show that farmers are more likely to respond to market requirements from their buyer for a change rather than regulatory changes even. And there are many examples of integrated supply chains that have driven really good sustainable farming practices, requiring measurement and plans to reduce environmental impacts. And there's also the case of these emerging direct markets that we've seen during COVID and prior to that, but I think even more so during COVID, where farm credentials are very important and a very important selling point. We also have this emerging private sector environmental markets that are developing. The most advanced are underpinned by government actions, so the carbon and in the future there will be biodiversity net gain. These markets largely involve land use change, whether for carbon capture or through planting trees or land managed for wildlife and quality. There are lots of key areas with this. There's a lot. It's a subject in its own right, I think. The CLA we've recently published a series of natural capital guidance notes for farmers and land managers, covering how to measure natural capital, how to understand this emerging marketplace, and how to access the markets. They set out the natural capital supply chain. It's not as simple as a buyer and a seller getting together. It could be, but it's not. There's a whole new industry developing with brokers, aggregators, delivery bodies, auditors, and of course, investors who are looking for investment at scale to make a big change. What has become clear while we've been doing this work is that this market is still in quite an early stage of development, and there are many areas around governance and standards that need to be resolved before it can really blossom into something that's really going to drive change. There are pioneers already operating and working with these marketplaces, but there's a long tail of people who are still unclear about what that means and what it will mean for their business and what they should be doing in order to develop that. And particularly with the government programme around environmental land management being still requiring more detail, it's very difficult for people to know exactly what to do now. So the question of whether these emerging markets for natural capital have any synergies with profitable food production is an interesting one. I think the answer is yes, but it might not be clearly signalled and may not be anything new actually. There are examples of premiums being paid for certain production systems, organic being the longest one with a legally defined production system. But there's conservation grade oats and the leaf mark have been around for over 30 years. And there are many more marketing standards that are gaining traction and higher prices, such as pasture-fed livestock. The water companies have been providing advice and funding into priority areas to improve water quality, and that's leading to changing in farming practices in those areas. And we mustn't forget that the government has also been involved in environmental markets for many years with the agri-environment schemes, so Countryside Stewardship and its predecessors, and Glasssteer in Wales and equivalent in Scotland. So that has shown that it can positively influence profitable food production. The new Sustainable Farming Incentive part of ELM will also introduce new standards for arable and grassland production and soil management that will support the profitable production of environmentally sustainably produced crops and livestock. So from a farmer and land manager's point of view, it feels at this moment in time that there is a bewildering range of possible directions for any business. Lots of drivers for change, but really not any clear direction to be taken. And an equally bewildering lack of information on policies and these emerging markets. And while many are keen to address the climate emergency and the nature crisis, a bottom line is the need to be profitable, and we mustn't forget that. There's some great ideas, great things going on, but ultimately, in order for this to work, it needs to make economic sense. And there are challenges across a whole range of issues. I'm just going to touch briefly on land tenure because that was in my remit, although I'm going to broaden it out rather cheekily. You can come back to me on specific tenancy issues if you'd like. But I think this is really more about land mobility and new entrants, or even more broadly, getting the right people in to make management decisions on farms. So this doesn't need to be just through farm tenancy. There's a growing interest in joint venture models such as share farming, machinery and labour collaboration, or indeed shared management or franchise farming, all of which can bring new skills and ideas, whatever the size of business, into play. There's been an awful lot of interest in the DEFRA exit scheme, which was mentioned earlier, and perhaps more than we'd anticipated actually, but we don't know the details yet. But I think that's an indication of change to come. And I think the related land mobility and new entrants issues, the CLA is supporting the development of the Institute for Horticulture and Agriculture, or Agriculture and Horticulture, sorry, got them wrong around, which is an industry government partnership to really put some energy behind addressing the perennial problems of low investment in skills and training in the sector and development of a more professional sector, which will hopefully include more knowledge and understanding of the environment. So last few minutes, how can we make ecological and mixed farming landscapes more investable? This is a good question, and it's not one to say and to answer. From a livestock perspective, it's not easy or possible or desirable even to introduce cropping, and the need for specialised machinery and knowledge is key. And ditto from the arable perspective, there are fencing costs, transport, skilled labour, and concerns about biosecurity and endemic risks. So it's not an easy transition to make, and there's a reason why we have become specialised. But there are also reasons why we might want to unravel that to some extent. As ever, I think it's going to require actions on a number of fronts, and it will take time. Central is the development of supportive government policies. In England, this is embedded in public goods delivery, and clearly organic systems and mixed farming systems have the potential to deliver a wide range of public goods that will help support that move. But there's also a need for targeted investment and grants for the infrastructure. We also need to develop the knowledge and skills, and also, I think one of the areas is about being more innovative in these business partnerships, which shouldn't just be limited to tenancies, and could really help to unlock and bring in new talent into the sector to make these changes become reality. I could also add a point about a supportive tax system, but that was a whole new subject in its own right. So I'm going to say there, I will just summarise in saying that there are drivers all pointing in the direction of more agroecological farming practices, but all farms are unique and require a different solution. We mustn't lose sight of individual innovation and ambitions, which will be at the core of paving that way for a more sustainable farming future. Thank you.
Super, thank you, Susan. That's yeah, a lot a lot to run through. Apologies for giving such a broad-ranging brief, but I think we'll just come straight into a question from the audience from Martin Large, just around land ownership and the new entrants aspect you were just talking about. You know, how are we going to get sort of young farmers, and I guess more, whether joint ventures or share farming operations, are these the right structures at the moment? Do we have the right mechanics to get more new entrants, more young people, more entrepreneurs linked into existing land holdings and existing landscapes to farm in this way and produce food in the way that we all want? Do we have the right answers at the moment? And are there any interesting examples, from your members on how they're going about this?
I mean, I think there are a number of gaps that still need to be addressed. There are some, the share farming model has been around for a number of years, and it is really a very flexible model that can be applied in lots of different ways to get new people into the industry and to allow them a start without them needing to have a large capital basis behind. I think as far as landowners are concerned, as far as getting new entrants is concerned, I think part of that is the exiting from the industry. I think something that the current policy is going to do is making people think about their future in the industry, and particularly how they're farming and looking at these opportunities. And I think there is an opportunity now to look at alternative ways of getting other people in to manage the land, which might be, for some, the right answer might be to do a formal farm business tenancy. For others, it might be to look at share farming. For others, it might be to look at a more innovative type of joint venture where there's a different sort of sharing of the skills and knowledge. And equally, very small land projects, and looking at intensively managed agroecological units that are maybe small but highly productive. So if you're looking at poultry or some of the fruit and veg industries, you don't need to have masses of land. So I think the door is open for ideas, and many landowners are looking for interesting ideas about how they might change how their tenancy profile in the future, because there are doors opening because of the potentially people leaving the industry, but also wanting to do different things. I'm just trying to think of some examples. I mean, I think I think it's always a go-to place, but the Duchy and Cornwall have been doing some very interesting and innovative things to get new people in, but also working with them to help them develop their skills and knowledge, and that support to make them to feel that they're part of the community, mentoring systems to help integrate into the area. They all help in making these things a reality.
Super, thank you, Susan. And then just a question from Stephen Jacobs, just on productivity and kind of like, what do we mean by it? It's sort of, it feels like sometimes it's quite a big catch-all term. Like, what's your sense of it from the CLA point of view? And is it the be all and end all? Like, what? Yeah, give us your.
Well, I think if you're trying to extract funding and support from government, productivity is an important term, and it is about efficiency. It's not about producing more necessarily. It's about producing more efficiently. Productivity growth is really what we're looking for. It's about producing more from less, really. It's what we're looking to be doing, looking to achieve. I think many people, when they hear productivity, they're thinking about producing more. And actually, you can increase your productivity quite simply by producing less, but using even less inputs. And I think that's where the measurement of it's a ratio. The measurement doesn't have a lot of practical sense for most farmers on an individual basis. So we tend to talk about profitability as a much more tangible thing. But it is important when you're in your economics world around justifying funding coming into the sector to boost productivity growth. And it's an important measure of how the sector is developing. So it's important, but I think from a farmer and landowner perspective, profitability is probably a more recognizable term.
Super, thank you, Susan. And then, last one, which is from Bill Grayson, just around land use planning, essentially, and the fact that farmers always respond to market cues, essentially, and what the market says. But at the same time, we're developing a whole policy environment to try and stimulate it from that direction, and we have a whole set of different market cues coming into the mix as well, through desire for carbon offsetting and biodiversity net gain and a whole heap of others. Is there a way of handling this yet, or is it just kind of just let it happen and see where people respond to best? Does there need to be some sort of framework to govern this? I'm not sure if I'm being very clear, but if you've got any points, then that would be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think fundamental to this is a good governance framework. I mean, from a landowner, land manager's perspective, going into any of these markets, you need to be secure about what you're selling, how long you're selling it for, who you're dealing with. It's a contractual arrangement that you're making, but it's for something that is less tangible, perhaps, than selling a ton of grain or a ton of parsnips. And I think that's where the difficulty comes in, is sort of imagining what your carbon in your trees actually looks like. I think the governance has got to come from government as well. I think there are certain aspects that they need to be involved in, and that's where we're doing work with Treasury and other government departments to try and working with other people working in this sector to try and establish better governance, to make sure that there is confidence from the buyer side, confidence from the sellers. And what we don't want is this market to be discredited in the future because people have there's not been the standard set. And I think that's my biggest concern, is that we all hear about airline companies offsetting by planting 7 hectares of trees in Ireland, but it's really not, that's not, it's doing the job, but it's not in the spirit of what needs to happen. And I think it's making sure that we underpin this market with good governance so that it is established and long-lived, because that's the best way to get to help support farming businesses, but also to get the environmental delivery that we need and the changes that we need in the land use to support that.
Super, thank you, Susan. And thank you everyone for keeping your questions and comments and feedback coming in. This is really great to see, and do keep it coming, because this is all hugely valuable for how we take this forward. And just a little reminder, hopefully some issues with accessing the survey, but hopefully that might be working its way through. Anyway, I just wanted to bring in at this stage Archie from Spain's Hall Estate over in Essex, who is having a go at sort of, reimagining on quite a big scale the land use there. And Archie, I guess the question is, what are you setting about trying to do, and why are you doing it? Archie, over to you.
Thanks, Will. And first of all, thank you for including me in this session. I feel a little bit of an interloper here because there are so many experts that I can see on the screen, and the people you've already heard from are far more expert in this than I am. But what I'm trying to do is translate some of these really knotty problems onto, well, what do I do at a field scale? And I'm lucky enough to be a part of a family that own 2,000 acres, so 800 hectares in northwest Essex. And at the moment, 660 of those hectares are cropped. We have a mix of farming tenants, so we have multi-generational Agricultural Holdings Act tenants who will be, whose families will be on the land long after I am, and have been on the land long before I arrived. But we also have farming business tenants, and we have some in-hand land as well. We have around 80 hectares of woodland already, so we have about 10% of woodland. And as part of a natural capital appraisal that I spearheaded last year, we sort of reimagined some of the ways that we measure our land. And one of the key metrics that came out of it was, Neil's talked about hedgerows earlier, and that's a really interesting one because we've always been very used to measuring our hedgerows in a linear basis. We've got so many kilometers of hedgerows, but actually what we did is we got a new data set and we flew over the top of it and said, actually, we've got 19 hectares of hedgerows. And that means that actually we can start to think about, what is the biomass that that's producing? What is the carbon that's sequestering? How do we then manage those hedgerows in a slightly different way? But the backdrop to all of this, because I come from prior to coming back to run the family business, I worked in catchment management with environmental charities. So the ecosystem approach is something that I naturally go to in terms of trying to understand how things happen, and water flows is where I start from because that's my sort of comfort zone. And so in that remit, I started to look at solving problems that we have in the neighbourhood. And we have a flooding problem in our local village. It's a very small village. There are 18 houses at risk. It would never get flood funds from any other source. So we had to be a bit creative, and I wanted to try and do something with my prior knowledge, but also my ability to influence land use on that. And so we dreamt up a natural flood management project, which used sort of standard sort of timber engineering techniques. We used wood from the estate to slow the water down, reconnect the floodplain, but we also used beavers. So we brought beavers back into the estate. And this sort of exemplifies my kind of way of looking at these sort of things, is that I understand that there are a massive array, and we've heard some of them today, massive array of issues to contend with, a massive diversity of approaches, and you just have to look at the chat to realize that there are people doing a million different things. And at some point, if you're in any way in charge of a landholding, you've got to work out which ones to pick. You've then got to go down a route, and then you start to have some of those challenges that Susan and others have outlined in terms of, how's it taxed? How do the revenue and the capital elements stack up? How does the management system look like? Which things can you actually derive a revenue stream from, and which things are things that you perhaps shouldn't be trying to market? So this is sort of the background of our thinking, which has evolved into a natural capital appraisal, which started to give us some kind of figures for this. So we did do some sort of pounds, shillings and pence valuations over the whole estate, but what we also did is look at transition. So I have a node of project plans which include more beaver areas and a sort of riparian rewilding project of around about 100 acres, so sort of 40 odd hectares. Woodland creation to link up areas of semi-natural, semi-ancient woodland that we've got, but also then things like agroforestry that sort of Niels and others were talking about. So I know that there are people on the call here I can see, and I know that are ahead of me in terms of actually delivering agroforestry. But what we're trying to do is look at how do we transition about half of our cropped area, so between 300 and 400 hectares, from its current sort of conventional commodities driven system. So very much you could say it's a food first approach, but the food it produces variously goes directly into the human supply chain, or it goes via animal feeds or something like that, or even in some cases it just goes straight into an anaerobic digester. So we're trying to think about, how do I flip that? So from my perspective, looking at it from a business point of view, I've got revenue streams that I do from some of our diversified activities like holiday cottages, wildlife watching, woodlands, things like that. But then the vast majority of my income at the moment, my business income at the moment, is tenant rents. So I look at that and I immediately look down my own kind of financial supply chain and go, well, hang on a minute, that's a bit of a risk. Everyone's incomes are everyone in the agricultural sector's incomes are going to change over the next 10 years. Some of those are going to come under significant pressure. Some of the tenants we've got are operating at relatively small scale. So there's two things. One is, how do I mitigate my own risk from a business, but also how do I introduce additional opportunities for my tenants that means that then their businesses are more sustainable in the long term. It's all very well asking them to introduce diversity into their system, but if they're trying to support 2 families off 250 acres, even in East Anglia, where we've got some nice productive land, it's a tough ask to say, you need to take this amount out of production, or the transition, the financial transition is tough, because if you're going to reduce your revenue flows, you need to find some way of basically paying the bills. And the same, doesn't matter what scale you're operating at, the same is true for me and my business. So what I'm trying to do now is map out a system where the end point is a much more balanced system. So I perhaps don't produce food as my first port of call, but actually I am an environmental goods producer. So I produce clean water, I produce plentiful water, and I reduce flood risk. So, those are things that I understand and I think I can do on my holding. And then we also look at biodiversity. So we were lucky enough to be selected as one of the 9 national pilot projects for the Natural England's Biodiversity Net Gain pilot. So we're getting a really good insight as to how that might work, but also then things like carbon sequestration. And you very quickly run into some of these blockers that your other speakers have articulated far better than I can. That some systems fall within existing accreditation schemes. So woodland creation, tick, you can get a carbon income on that through the Woodland Carbon Code. Agroforestry, no, you can't, because it doesn't fall within the definition of forestry under the Forestry Act and various other issues. So, there's a lot of things you can't do. Soil carbon, there is no current UK accreditation system for that either. So, whilst I'm only going to be looking to sell the excess, that means that my business is climate positive, and then I sell the bits that I generate over and above the things that I need to offset my own unavoidable emissions. I still can't do that in an accredited setting. I also can't do water in an accredited setting. There is no accreditation for systems, actions, practices, outcomes measurements for clean water. So we've built a partnership with our local water companies where we're trying to build a baseline for these sort of things. So this is where I sort of come at this from. And the final element, which I was really pleased was picked up by a lot of people that you've heard from today, actually is the social side of things. So my estate, back at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, housed and provided employment for directly, it was over 100 people. Now, my estate, I employ myself and 2 others. So, that just shows you what the change in farming systems are. I think perhaps it was Janet was saying earlier about, the kind of replacement of people in the environment. Now, what I'm suggesting isn't that we just try and create employment for the sake of employment. What I'm suggesting is that part of this system, if I introduce diversity to my system, there will be more opportunities to pick up some of the things that Susan was saying about, harnessing different ways of working with social entrepreneurs, commercial entrepreneurs. We've got a growing relationship with a charity that looks at delivering mental health, well-being, skills training, using the kind of environment to do that. So, it's building all of these things into what is otherwise currently a fairly simple system. And it's fair to say that some of my contemporaries and some of my members of my family look at me like I'm mad, because I'm just trying to do, I'm trying to bring all these things into one relatively small land area. And whilst it's large enough for me to get my teeth into. Susan's point about scale is very interesting, because it's just, I still can't demonstrate enough impact to be talking to any of the kind of investment market. So it's all just trying to work out how do we deliver these things, but then do it in a way that I can then in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time have enough information to be able to demonstrate my impact, but also then feed back into my management system that says, okay, you put agroforestry systems in place here, here, and here. This one is doing brilliant things for biodiversity. This one's doing brilliant things for nutrition. This one's not doing great for anything. Right, okay, let's change that system. Let's see if we can deliver something better, and be flexible and be responsive, rather than the current way that I look out my office window and see, I've got a hedge, a woodland, a field, and just sort of say, well, actually, traditional wisdom says that it's very risky to change any of that. So, do tiny little bits on the edge first. I confess to being quite impatient. The environmental land management scheme isn't going to be fully operable till 2024. Climate change, the biodiversity crisis, these are things that we absolutely need to act on now. So I really want to be fully up and running with a new system within 2 or 3 years. Because if it takes much longer than that, we're just losing the game. We're heading closer towards 4 degrees temperature rise, and in our part of East Anglia, that's going to be, the land grade that I farm on, which is currently 2 to 3, could actually degrade down to 2050, could degrade down to 4. So unless I do something about it now, I'm actually my underlying assets are going to degrade, and I'm not going to be able to support the business. So, yeah, I hope that's useful.
Super, thank you, Archie. You covered again an awful lot of ground there. I wanted to come back to something which I think is implicit in a lot of comments and questions coming in on this workshop and the last one. It's about how do we, and I think you were partly answering it just at the end there, but making some very big, substantial land use changes and to a business which has been farmed, or an area that's been farmed in a certain way for so long, and as you say, it feels, most people perceive it as risky, and we should just be tinkering around the edges. How do you get to a point where you're willing to, is it purely driven by fears of climate change and what you're witnessing and observing in your natural environment, or I don't know how to articulate it, but it's how do people make these are sort of generational decisions we're kind of making to landscapes and land use here. That's what we're talking about, as opposed to an annual decision, as it might be in terms of what option you're going to take out in elms or whatever stewardship scheme is coming up. How did you get to that point?
I think it was a combination of things for me. I mean, I set out a few years ago to expand my knowledge, supported by the excellent work that the CLA do, whom I'm a member of, and get an amount of value out of. And then I went off and did further study, because I thought, I don't know enough. I don't know how to answer the question. I don't even know how to ask some of the questions. And then that led itself to me just being able to drop into different sectors. So I've got a perhaps slightly unusual view on life. So I've still got a foot in the environmental NGO world. I've got a little bit of a foot in the water industry, because that's where I started my career. And then I'm obviously in land management as well. So I have seen the different drivers across this. And then I've got pulled into kind of global agricultural investor conversations, and seeing how the investors and things like the climate change discussions and risk is being viewed from that kind of area. And all of this just came back to me, and I said, it just became almost a completely compelling narrative that I need to do something about it. And I need to be able to, because I have management control, the onus is on me to have to try and do something about it. And the moment you put yourself out there and saying, well, actually, I'm willing to take a chance, a bit like we did with the beavers and natural flood management, people get on board pretty quickly and they support you. And this is what I'm trying to do again with this sort of larger scale land management change, is have those conversations and essentially challenge some of these potential buyers that Susan and others outlined, and say, okay, well, you say you really want to produce clean water. Here we go. I've got a system that I think can do it. I'm willing to work with you to design that system to maximize its potential for that. But I'm going to be losing revenue because I'm going to change my system, certainly for a time. How do we work together to solve that? So, you know, it's just being open and somewhat challenging, and just give people the opportunity to contribute.
Super, thank you. I'll come to you quickly again, Archie, just on something which is a common theme and question. It's just about supply chains, and I'll come to Janet probably next as we go into more sort of open discussion. But you know, thinking about routes to market, a lot of people have been saying, and certainly the workshop last week reflected this, that we can all change how we farm and manage our land and improve our soils and improve, the sort of natural processes within our control. But what we can't do is market that and get those routes to market working to whether it's our retailers or other market points of size and scale as well. How are you thinking about, I know you're thinking about a balance and a mix of different sort of market opportunities, but how are you thinking about that sort of supply chain sort of market access challenge?
So, I mean, I'm looking at supply chains across the board. So, you know, a supply chain for me might be clean water, it might be biodiversity, it might be things. So what I'm trying to do is uncover the actors in those sections, sections of the supply chain that might be relevant to me. And I almost consider the commodity side of things, or any food product, the supply chains are already there. You know, in terms of, you know, I mean, there are examples in East Anglia of people finding routes to market for things like homegrown lentils and, you know, haricot beans, and, you know, there's lots and lots of other people doing really interesting things. And I don't think I need to be an expert in them. I'm not an expert farmer by any means. So the way I'm going to approach it with those sort of products is I will set the system up to deliver the environmental goods, because that's my niche. And I will then provide an opportunity for anybody who wishes to come in and work with me, either on a social enterprise basis or on a commercial enterprise basis. We will try and find a working model that works for both of us, and they can then help me develop those supply chains, because there are far more things that I can potentially produce than I could ever be an expert in. It might be everything from distilling products to, you know, nut butters to, you know, God knows what. I mean, there's a huge amount of things that we could produce on, you know, a best part of 1,000 acres of land. I can't be an expert in any of them. And also I want to be able to try things out. So I want people to be able to come in and say, okay, I can't get access to land. I can't sign up for a 5-year tenancy, whatever. Okay, we'll find a way of working with you. We will support you. We will find a way of providing you with a space into which you can develop your niche business. And if that niche business takes off, then great, we will see whether we can develop that relationship. But, you know, we've got to be able to try, because a lot of the old models just don't work. Yeah.
Janet, a lot of interest in this space, I know. What are your reflections on how do we get this sort of like chicken and egg situation between what we can produce and how we get it to market?
I feel very humbled by the fact that there's so many here with proper practical knowledge, so please forgive me if I talk about things that I don't have direct practical experience of, because you are the people that really know. But just listening to Archie there was really interesting. When you started off by equating commodity and food, I thought, oh dear. But then you made the point, which is really important, which is that if we're going to do this, we need to get collaborating, because you've got skills in environment, but there'll be other people farming around you who have skills in food, you know, and if they can help you to think about how to use your productive acres to add value and to produce more diverse products, then that's a really good thing to do. And you can use your specialist knowledge, which is about environmental management and, you know, ecosystem services, to help them. And I think that's something that's really important. I think also people who are working at the scale of estates have a huge opportunity here to help to rebuild some of the infrastructure that's been lost in the countryside by this whole process of farm enlargement and specialization. You know, we've lost a lot of the bits between the producer and the final consumer in rural areas that we used to have, which allowed for a lot more diversity to exist at the local level. You know, if all the sheep that you produce on Exmoor end up being lorried up to North Wales to the big Dunbeer slaughterhouse, you know, you've lost an opportunity to connect there with your customers. And some of that infrastructure could be put back through the people who operate at a bigger scale than the individual farm. That could be a combination of government action, but it could also involve people managing estates or people who are more involved with kind of higher level planning. And I think that we really don't have enough people managing the land now. So if people talk about productivity, I'm very happy with the idea of productivity from the land, you know, multiple benefits from the management of land, embracing environment, food production, social benefit, but don't use productivity as a way of getting rid of more people from the management of our countryside, because we need more people managing the countryside. And you can do it if you have that approach to building diversity into your production systems. I have a great example of a farmer who spoke at a European event I went on about encouraging the younger generation into farming, who qualified at an agricultural college in France. And he and 6 of his colleagues had gone to manage a 60-hectare beef farm in the Limousin. And in the space of 10 years, they'd completely transformed it from being a one product, you know, specialist enterprise to something where each of them brought their different talents to bear on how that resource could be managed. And it was supporting these 6 farmers and their families off the same area of land. You know.
Thank you, Janet. I want to come to Niels next. We got into hedgerows quite quickly, and I was just, you know, one of the questions I remember you putting to us is around local routes to market for coppicing, for wood fuel, for making this hedgerow improvement, creation of habitat corridors, getting the edge effect between trees and soils, making that an enterprise in itself within your landscape. But what are the examples that you're seeing, and how would you address the supply chain sort of routes to market challenge? You're on mute.
Are you saying that we might be a bit stuck in the hedge?
Yeah.
Well, I guess the main example I would point to is the firewood business down in Devon. I might be able to look his name up actually. I forget his name basically, but he's done a really quite thorough write-up basically. Ross Dickinson, Racedown Farm, Dorset, and they're so basically he's done a really good assessment based on 220 meters of mixed hedge, and that is basically is a profitable endeavor basically. So bringing in £5,000 in total after wages basically. So that's definitely a good one. He's selling locally. But to be honest, I would say that like most sort of like wood fuel stuff, you should look at sort of on farm supply initially. I think that's probably where the low hanging fruit is. So you definitely want to be eliminating any heating oil coming onto the farm. You know, so like we don't want to see the kind of like the truck coming onto the farm anymore. And you know, we could be looking at being self-sufficient in bedding if we are continuing to house, for example. We can be looking at producing very, very high grade compost, for example, which you can produce with either just straight wood chip, for example, or wood chip and FIM. And yeah, I mean, I think that like sort of we should look at it as a sort of primary fertility source, basically, and you know, sort of high grade, fungally dominated worm compost and aerobic compost will give excellent yield results and significant step changes in soil health, basically. And it's about shifting that fungal dominance, basically.
Yeah. Super. Right. I'm really conscious that we've got 3 minutes left of this great discussion. It could go on and on, but just to find, Susan, I'm going to come to you next. Just the final question, really about people. But before we do that, just a reminder to plug the survey and the form and the feedback form, and sort of reimagining your own landscape at home would be really valuable to us. So, Susan, I think a lot of what we talked about comes back to people and the importance of getting people back onto our land and into our landscapes. And a question from, I've lost it now. Anyway, they'll know who they are, just about brokerage opportunities. And, you know, it's just a thought with representing a lot of members and land holdings. Is there the room for more? I think it's something that's been talked about a lot over the years, brokerage opportunities between sort of new entrants and food entrepreneurs and landowners. Is that something we can get on with quicker? Like, is there appetite for that now within your membership base, do you think?
Yeah, I think there is. It's not everybody, not everybody wants to do that, but there are certainly a number, and particularly if you're looking at the larger estates, then they're actively looking for opportunities to work with new entrants because they recognise the value of that. And new entrants doesn't necessarily mean young people, it could be new entrants of any age or stage. So I think we need to keep an open mind on what that actually means. I think there's part of that drive could come from the new entrants themselves. And I think, approaching landowners with ideas, with reasoned, well thought out business plans that are attractive, they're not going to be turning away. And I think this opportunity around the likely churn in the industry over the next few years and will create those opportunities. So I think everything is right for that sort of reinvigoration of new people coming into the industry to help drive that. How that's actually done, I mean, we've got, there's Fresh Start, which has been in existence for a number of years, that can put people together. I think there's evidence that works at a local area as well as a national scale. So I think it's working out how best to actually make that work. So I'd certainly encourage that.
Super, thank you, Susan. And it's now 1:30, so we're going to draw this to a close. But thank you very much for all of your contributions from all of the participants who stayed on the call, and your contributions in the chat, your questions, and your engagement. Thank you hugely to our speakers and panelists, Janet Dwyer, Susan Twining, Niels Corfield, and to Archie Rugglesbury's hugely valuable contributions, and hopefully very stimulating for all of us to go away and do something as a result of this conversation. Our next week, we'll be doing our next session on this, which will be focusing on the economics very deliberately of this, on what this costs at a farm business level, and also how do we keep this affordable for consumers in this country. So thank you also finally to Verity from our team, who makes the technology happen and keeps this all up and running. Without further ado, that is it. And thank you very much for joining us.